SoHo is one of the most photographed neighborhoods in New York City, and almost everyone who visits gets it wrong. They see the boutiques and the crowds on Broadway and assume that's the whole story. It isn't. Beneath the shopping bags and the Instagram photos is the largest surviving cast iron district on Earth, sitting on top of one of the strangest, most dramatic histories of any neighborhood in Manhattan. In the next minutes, we're covering all of it. The farmland, the red light district, the sweatshops, the artists who broke the law to save it, and everything worth seeing in SoHo today. Long before SoHo had a name, this land was farmland, and it was given to freed black colonists by the Dutch West India Company, making it the first free black settlement on Manhattan Island. For most of the 1700s, natural obstacles like ponds, swamps, and hills kept the city from expanding this far north, so the area stayed rural well after the rest of Lower Manhattan was built up. By the early 1800s, that changed completely. SoHo became one of the city's wealthiest residential neighborhoods, filled with mansions, hotels, theaters, and even early department stores like Tiffany & Company. Broadway, right through the middle of the neighborhood, was the city's premier entertainment strip, full of theaters, hotels, and gambling houses catering to wealthy New Yorkers. But by the mid-1800s, the side streets off Broadway had quietly become the city's first red light district, and the same blocks known for luxury shopping by day were known for something very different by night. As the wealthy fled uptown to escape the reputation, commerce and industry moved in. Cast iron factories and warehouses replaced the mansions, and the neighborhood became a center of textile manufacturing. That industry came at a cost. Sweatshops filled the same buildings that now house luxury boutiques, often employing immigrants and children for long hours and little pay. By the 20th century, the neighborhood had earned a much darker nickname, Hell's 100 Acres, thanks to how frequently its aging, densely packed factories caught fire. By the 1930s, during the Great Depression, some of these same empty lots held makeshift settlements of tents and shacks, built by people who had nowhere else to go in the middle of Manhattan. Part of what kept the area rural for so long was the terrain itself. A swamp, a pond, and a hill once stood roughly where SoHo's busiest shopping blocks are today, and none of it was easy to build on. After World War II, the textile industry began moving south, leaving behind block after block of empty factory buildings, huge, sunlit, and nearly worthless on paper. Starting in the 1950s, a very different kind of tenant noticed those empty lofts. Artists who needed space to work on a scale no apartment could offer, and who could not afford it anywhere else in Manhattan. They moved in illegally, converting abandoned factory floors into studios and homes without permits, without heating built for residential use, and without the city's permission. To warn firefighters that someone was living inside a supposedly empty commercial building, artists began posting small signs reading AIR, Artist in Residence, a quiet workaround that became a neighborhood symbol. At the same time, the neighborhood faced an existential threat. City planner Robert Moses proposed running an expressway straight through it, which would have demolished the cast iron district entirely. A coalition of artists and preservationists fought the plan for years. The expressway was eventually canceled, and the same buildings almost lost to a highway are the ones still standing today. The artists who had been living there illegally organized too. In 1971, after years of pressure from the SoHo Artists Association, the city finally legalized loft living, but only for certified artists. 2 years later, in 1973, SoHo was declared a protected historic district by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, permanently saving its cast iron buildings from demolition. The irony is hard to miss. The same legal protection that saved SoHo for artists is exactly what made it desirable to everyone else. By the late 1970s, boutiques were already moving into ground floors once occupied by working artists. The price jump tells the story better than words can. A SoHo building that sold for around $10,000 in 1969 was going for over $40,000 just 5 years later. And today, the same buildings are worth many millions. The protected historic district itself kept growing too. In 2010, it was extended further east and along more of West Broadway, covering even more of the original cast iron blocks. Today, roughly 250 cast iron buildings still stand across SoHo's 26 blocks, the largest concentration of this architecture anywhere in the world. Cast iron let architects mass-produce ornate decorative facades cheaply, casting elaborate columns and details that would have cost a fortune to carve from real stone. The Haughwout Building, completed in 1857 at Broadway and Broome Street, is considered one of the finest examples, modeled after a 16th century Venetian palazzo. It also made engineering history. The Haughwout Building housed the world's first commercial passenger elevator, installed by Otis, at a time when tall buildings were still a novelty. A few blocks over, the Little Singer Building shows a completely different side of cast iron design. Lighter, more delicate ironwork than the heavier facades nearby. On Greene Street, look up for the building nicknamed the Queen of Greene Street, crowned with an elaborate Second Empire mansard roof that's become one of the most photographed roof lines in the neighborhood. Its counterpart down the block earned the nickname King of Greene Street. Bolder proportions, heavier ironwork, and just as much of a local landmark. Many of these facades still carry their original construction dates on the cornice, or small foundry plaques naming exactly which company cast the iron more than 150 years ago. The process itself was almost industrial in a different sense. Ornate pieces were cast in foundries, then bolted together on site like a kit of parts, which is part of why SoHo could be built so quickly. Most of these facades were originally painted to imitate stone, since cast iron on its own looked too obviously like metal for the wealthy tastes of the era. If you only walk one block in SoHo, make it Greene Street between Grand and Canal, widely considered the single finest stretch of cast iron architecture in the city. Wooster Street runs a quieter, calmer version of the same architecture, with fewer crowds, more galleries, and a slower pace than Broadway just one block over. Prince Street connects SoHo north into the Nolita neighborhood, and it's lined with some of the best small cafes in the entire area. West Broadway is the widest, busiest street in the neighborhood, useful mainly for getting your bearings before ducking down a quieter side street. And Broadway itself is where SoHo turns fully commercial. Flagship stores standing shoulder to shoulder with independent boutiques, all inside the same 19th century cast iron shells. Mercer Street, running parallel to Broadway, is narrower and quieter still. Once lined with brothels in the 1800s, now home to some of SoHo's most understated storefronts. SoHo has been one of the most fashionable shopping districts in New York for decades, and even with online shopping reshaping retail everywhere else, it hasn't slowed down much here. On Greene Street, a landmarked 1878 cast iron building now holds a 6th-floor luxury retail space, spanning women's wear, menswear, fine jewelry, and home goods under one roof. On Grand Street, contemporary designers keep their flagship stores tucked between historic facades, with minimalist interiors hiding behind windows built more than a century earlier. For something different, SoHo also hides some of the city's best vintage stores, smaller, quieter, and easy to miss if you don't know which doors to open. And if shopping isn't your thing, SoHo's independent bookstores are some of the quietest, most overlooked spots in the neighborhood, a completely different pace from the boutiques outside. One particularly striking example, the corner that once held one of SoHo's most notorious brothels in the 1800s, is now home to a flagship tech retail store, a 400-year timeline compressed into a single address. Contemporary labels have their own SoHo footholds too, from edgy minimalist menswear brands on Grand Street to designer accessory lines that helped define 2010's New York fashion. A newer addition to the neighborhood is a curated multi-brand space built specifically to launch independent and emerging designers from around the world, all under one roof. SoHo is also one of the most popular neighborhoods in Manhattan for boutique hotels, drawing a mix of design-conscious travelers and a fair number of celebrities. Stay long enough at one of the neighborhood's better-known hotels, and there's a real chance you'll spot a famous face in the lobby. SoHo has quietly become one of the go-to spots for celebrities visiting New York. No SoHo guide is complete without the bakery that started the city's most famous pastry obsession. In 2013, this SoHo bakery invented the cronut, half croissant, half donut, and lines have formed outside its doors nearly every morning since. Beyond the famous names, SoHo's side streets are full of small cafes that never make the tourist lists, but are exactly where locals actually go. Tucked into a quiet corner near the water is a bar that's been serving drinks since 1817, one of the oldest buildings still standing in Manhattan. Its sign originally read "Bar," But after decades of weather faded the paint, only 3 letters were still legible, which is exactly how the bar got the name it still uses today. Inside, it still looks the way an 1817 tavern should. Dark wood, low ceilings, and regulars who've been coming back for years, long before SoHo had any tourists at all. After dark, SoHo shifts. The boutiques close and a quieter nightlife scene takes over. Cocktail bars, dessert spots, and late-night restaurants tucked along streets that were packed with shoppers just hours earlier. Brunch is practically a SoHo institution on weekends, with restaurants setting up sidewalk seating that fills up fast once the weather turns warm. The neighborhood's dining scene has grown far beyond pastries and coffee, now covering everything from casual noodle counters to reservation-only tasting menus, often within the same block. SoHo's gallery scene has quieted since its 1970s peak, when it was the undisputed center of the American avant-garde, but it never fully disappeared. On Wooster Street, one museum focuses entirely on works on paper, with a rotating program built around emerging artists rather than established names. A few doors down sits the first museum in the United States dedicated entirely to queer art, and it's completely free to walk in. For something more playful, SoHo's immersive art experience has been voted one of the country's best. A maze of brightly colored, Instagram-ready rooms built for wandering. Right on Broadway, an interactive ice cream-themed museum draws lines almost as long as the bakery a few blocks away. That immersive art experience was voted America's #1 by USA Today readers, which says something about how far SoHo's art scene has shifted from painting and sculpture toward experience-driven spaces built for a phone camera. Even with the shift, serious curators still treat SoHo galleries seriously. Smaller spaces here often show work years before it turns up in a bigger institution uptown. Housed in a 1904 Beaux-Arts firehouse, SoHo's Fire Museum is one of the most overlooked collections anywhere in the city. Inside, high ceilings and the original apparatus floor tell the story of American firefighting history, and almost no one outside the neighborhood seems to know it's there. Even stranger, one SoHo storefront has held the exact same art installation since 1977, an entire loft-filled floor-to-ceiling with hundreds of tons of dirt. It's free, open only a few days a week, and it might be the single most unexpected thing you'll find inside a Manhattan storefront. Step just 1 block off Broadway, and the crowds thin out almost completely. SoHo rewards anyone willing to wander a little further than the main shopping strip. A practical note: many of SoHo's streets are still paved with original cobblestones, which look great on camera but aren't kind to heels. Comfortable shoes make the walk much easier. SoHo isn't the first neighborhood people think of for families, but the Fire Museum and the Ice Cream Museum both work well if you're visiting with kids. And despite the luxury reputation, plenty of SoHo is genuinely free. Walking the architecture, browsing galleries, and visiting the Earth Room all cost nothing. Because SoHo is so small, it pairs easily with a longer day that includes Nolita to the north, or Little Italy, and Tribeca just to the south. If you've already covered Midtown skyscrapers and Lower Manhattan's financial towers, SoHo operates at a genuinely different pace. Lower buildings, narrower streets, and a scale that feels almost European. SoHo's major commercial gallery names have largely relocated to Chelsea over the past 2 decades, but SoHo kept the smaller, more experimental spaces that Chelsea's larger galleries left behind. Compared to nearby Tribeca, SoHo is louder, busier, and far more shopping-focused. Tribeca leans residential and quiet, while SoHo stays firmly a destination. SoHo's independent bookstores deserve more credit than they get. Many carry small press titles and art books you won't find in bigger chain stores anywhere else in the city. Even longtime residents say they still notice new details on buildings they've walked past hundreds of times. That's how densely packed SoHo's architecture really is. SoHo is bordered by Houston Street to the north, Canal Street to the south, Lafayette Street to the east, and 6th Avenue to the west, a compact 26 blocks in total. The neighborhood is easy to reach by subway, and small enough that almost everything worth seeing is within walking distance once you're there. Go early on a weekday morning if you want to actually see the architecture without fighting through weekend shopping crowds on Broadway. Plan for at least half a day, 4 to 5 hours is usually enough to cover the architecture, a meal, and a few shops without rushing. And bring a reason to look up. Most of Soho's best architectural details sit above eye level, on cornices and roof lines that most people walking Broadway never bother to check. If you're chasing photos, late afternoon light hits the cast iron facades on Greene Street directly, warming up details that look flat and gray at midday. Spring and fall tend to offer the most comfortable walking weather, with mild temperatures that make it easy to spend hours outside without rushing between stops. Summer brings the biggest crowds, especially on weekends, when Broadway can feel more like a packed mall than a historic street. Winter is quieter and colder, but the side streets take on a different kind of charm, with fewer people and clearer views of the architecture overhead. Even a rainy afternoon has its upside here. Wet cobblestones and cast iron facades reflecting streetlights make for some of the moodiest photos Soho has to offer. So, to put it all together, start on Greene Street for the architecture. It's the single best block in the neighborhood. Stop for a cronut or just a coffee somewhere along the way. Duck into a gallery or two on Wooster Street, where the crowds thin out. Visit the Fire Museum or the Earth Room if you want to see something almost no other tourist bothers to find. And end the day at a bar that's been open since before the Civil War, sitting on a block that's seen almost every version of New York. It's worth asking what comes next. Online shopping has already pulled some retail away from Broadway's storefronts. The same question locals were asking about brothels and factories a century ago is being asked again today. Whatever happens, the cast iron buildings themselves aren't going anywhere. They're protected now, permanently this time. Part of what makes Soho work is scale. Most buildings here top out around 5 or 6 stories, low enough that the street never disappears into shadow the way it does further uptown. That human scale, paired with architecture that survived a highway, a fire-prone industrial era, and decades of pressure to tear it all down, is really what people are responding to when they say Soho feels different. Few New York neighborhoods have reinvented themselves this many times, from farmland to red light district to sweatshops to an illegal artist colony, and fewer still kept this much of their history standing. One afternoon here is enough to understand why Soho still feels unlike anywhere else in Manhattan. This is episode 1 of our Manhattan Neighborhood series. Next, we're heading somewhere completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss where we go next.